Well, this is cozy. John, Gina, thank you for joining us today. Tariffs used to be sort of the province of pointy-headed journalists and academics, and now even voters care about tariffs and where America stands in the global economy. There's many avenues into this topic. I thought today we would just trim them down to two silos, tariffs and industrial policy. We're fortunate to have two people who exist on the front lines of both of these issues. And we'll just see where the conversation goes from here. Gina, we've come through, we're still in what I think is a pretty murky tariffs regime. There was a strong reaction in April when they were first rolled out. Different industries and different countries have lobbied for different forms of tariff relief. And now we've gotten to a recent chapter where China has invoked, I think, its own trading powers that maybe the White House hadn't anticipated around rare earths, and in a more kind of quotidian way, soybeans. You know, I've heard from so many businesses, right, that they still don't know how to navigate the current landscape, that there is still a lot of murkiness. It's not clear what the right strategy is moving forward. Do you think we're in a place now where some of this will get rationalized, or do you think it'll continue to be up in the air and it'll be a case-by-case basis?
Good question. Hard answer. Good question. Great to be here, as always. It is murky, and I think it'll remain murky. The one thing I think we can all count on is there will be tariffs, right? Like I know from experience, from working for President Biden, tariffs, once they're put on, are hard to take off. You know, President Biden did not take the tariffs from Trump 1, didn't lower them. I argued with him that he ought to, but it's very difficult. I think you see with this president, he came out strong with China, triple digit. You're not going to see 100+% tariffs in China. So I think, you know, the trade space is somewhere between, I don't know, 10, 15% and 50%. It depends on the country. There will be plenty of exemptions, as you said. But I think that, you know, we're kind of in an inflationary environment for some time, and I think that he will continue to maintain these tariffs. It's core to his strategy, and it is a real belief that, you know, tariffs work. And I think he feels he was elected to deliver, and so that's why I think they're here to stay.
Well, let's stay on that for a minute. I mean, I think the overt goal was that it would revivify the American manufacturing base. Do you see that happening?
You know, that's a complicated question. I think that American manufacturing is being revitalized. I think we've learned a lesson that we have to have more resilient supply chains, and there are certain things, pharmaceuticals, critical medicines, semiconductors, that we have to make some amount of in the United States. And that will continue. Net tariffs help on the margin with that, but it's a really complicated picture. For example, tariffing an input to a car that you want made in the United States makes it harder to manufacture. And you're continuing to see some tariffs on inputs. Which is a headwind. So I think you are going to see continued investment in the U.S. and more manufacturing. Whether or not that's because of tariffs, I'm not sure.
John, I was in Mexico, I don't know, 5 months ago, shortly around the time the tariff regime first sort of became publicly visible. And it was Mexican business leaders, and for the most part, they were astounded by it because U.S. manufacturers were based there and were sending goods up through their own supply chains back into the U.S. The relationship between Mexican manufacturing and U.S. production was so intimate as to be almost a full-blooded partnership. And since then, all I've heard from business leaders, both at companies small and large, reflect where the Mexicans were back then when they first voiced this to me, which is confusion. You know, one Canadian exporter of athletic supply goods said under one form of tariff contracts they were dealing with, the tariffs on an $800 product was $600. In a different scenario, it was only $6, but they didn't know when and why and where that would be implemented. Is that consistent with what you're hearing from Goldman's many clients? And who's navigated that the most effectively among the people you're talking to?
Well, first of all, I agree with Gina's perspective that I think this is a permanent fixture of the Trump administration's policy, and I think you'll see it continue to be the case. I think they started with a universal tariff, kind of all tariffs all the time across everything as a baseline, and I think what you're starting to see now is a movement to be more targeted. Partially, I think, because of the realities of supply chains, the realities of the exclusions that are needed to actually make companies work and to reduce inflation, and partially because I think as we head into the midterms, affordability becomes a very significant issue in America and a very significant political issue, and I think a particular concern for the Republicans trying to win the midterms. So I think you'll see them start to pull back. They already have, obviously, bananas, coffee, and the like, more agricultural and food products that are in the basket. I think you'll start to see more of that. Obviously, to your point, in Mexico, we have the USMCA negotiation in front of us in 2026. I think an incredibly important negotiation because to the point you're raising, that's kind of our backyard, right? That's where a lot of American, if we're going to revitalize American manufacturing, a lot of that is going to have to come through the Canadian and Mexican partnership, if you will, from dating way back from NAFTA all the way through to the USMCA that the president himself negotiated. And now we have the renegotiation in front of us. My own view, not everybody would share this view, is I think they will fall back to a much more regional alliance because the realities of actually driving down inflation and having a more sensible trade policy will require it. It may not be tariff-free, we'll have to see, but I think it will be a more measured approach vis-a-vis the USMCA.
One of the arguments is that the realities of the midterms, the reality of market reactions, will govern how the administration moves forward implementing different tariffs or even sticking by the ones they've already announced. And yet there hasn't been a steady and clear line about where the final shoe will drop. Do you envision after the midterms a revisiting of the tariff regimes that were put in or talked about publicly earlier this year?
Not necessarily.
Or do you think the administration will stay committed towards a reset?
As I said, I think it's a permanent fixture of the approach, and I think the notion of having bilateral tariff ability to navigate those relationships is the way that they want to conduct foreign policy. I don't see that changing post the midterms. To your earlier question, you can see the uncertainty in the economy. You can see the uncertainty among companies navigating it better and worse depending on their positioning. If you look at earnings, certain companies have much more impact, other companies less so. Certain companies have an ability to pass it on, other companies less so. We believe that much of the absorption of tariffs has actually been in the value chain in the company margin and hasn't been passed on.
Right.
So we would tend to expect more inflation on the forward because I think
First and second quarter.
I think you're going to start to see companies pass on more of the absorption that they've already dealt with in their margin structure. That's not sustainable over time. That will be somewhat balanced by the fact that I think the effective tariff rate is coming down. So if the effective tariff rate is plus minus 20% in the early part of the strategy, my guess is it's migrating down towards the mid-teens or even lower, depending on how these exclusions work and what they decide to do vis-a-vis USMCA and the like. So I expect it to start coming down while prices are rising and more pass-through is happening, and where those lines cross and where inflation comes out is going to be a very important indicator. But I think our view is inflation will remain sticky.
So you don't see inflation spiking in the first and second quarter of 26?
I don't know that it will spike. I think there's a lot of cross currents. You've got wage, you've got labor pressure. I think 26 is the year where you'll see more layoffs, and so I think you'll see corporate America start to work on their headcount, and that will bring down, I think, labor supply in many respects, which has a impact on taking wage pressure down. So that's a counterbalance to inflationary pressure, but then you do have tariffs that are more inflationary. And so, where that falls out is very hard to know. Our economists have their own views. The market is obviously trying to figure that out. That's a huge volatility measure in the marketplace right now. But I'd say, generally speaking, from our vantage point, feels like we're going to have more sticky inflationary pressure, and it's going to be very hard to bring the level of inflation down materially from here. But I don't see why it would spike necessarily. I don't see the inputs being a spike. I think it's just more kind of hard to bring it down from here.
Do you agree with that, Gina?
I do. I think, in addition to what John said, it's true that companies are taking it in their margin, but also they haven't raised their prices because they're still not sure of what's going to happen with tariffs. They're kind of waiting a little bit for things to settle out before they raise prices. And also, they stuffed the channel so massively in anticipation.
At least at the big corporate level. Don't you think the smaller and middle-sized businesses that are harder?
For sure, it's harder. The smaller the company, the harder it is.
Yeah.
The bigger the company, it's a lot easier for Amazon than anyone else. But every retailer did what they could, and they're still, even now, still burning through that inventory. So you haven't seen the increases. But CEOs are saying maybe we'll just increase prices when we introduce new products. A lot of CEOs are saying we can't raise prices on the existing product, we'll wait for new products. So, I don't have a crystal ball, but I don't think you'll see a spike per se.
Okay.
But I think we're in an inflationary environment, for some time. The other thing, which I believe, and, not everyone agrees, the thing about the Trump administration and the people around the president and people in Congress who support him, they really believe in tariffs. In other words, it isn't just a convenient political thing that they've done, although it is good politics, particularly in the Midwest.
But it's part of the creed.
It is. They think Pax Americana was a ripoff. They think America has been, ripped off. They think
American workers have been ripped off.
American workers have been hurt. China and other countries have subsidized and taken advantage. And so I wouldn't be so glib. It's not just a political tool.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's going to be difficult for future administrations to unwind some of this?
I really do. Now I have a specific viewpoint of this because I spent many hours in the Oval Office trying to convince President Biden to reduce some tariffs, particularly on inputs to things we want to manufacture in the U.S. And it was very hard to get that done because no one wants to be the American president accused of letting down the American worker, right? Like, tariffs protect the American worker. I think AI makes it, more so of a political reality. You don't want to be the president that is responsible for President Biden used to say to me, I don't want to be responsible for losing a single American manufacturing job. I'm not lowering the tariff. I
think that's exacerbated in 26 if you believe that we're going to see a tougher labor environment.
Correct.
So it actually becomes politically more complicated. I agree.
If any of you have questions for John or Gina, they'll land on my iPad, and I'll try to get a couple of them in within the next 11 minutes and 30 seconds. John, the administration seems surprised by the rare earths flex, or at least maybe not ready for it. Were you surprised at how aggressive China was in that moment in terms of, sort of cracking the whip when they did and how they did it? I'm
not surprised because I think the Chinese have been preparing for, Trump 2.0 for quite some time. And I think that they knew that they had certain points of leverage that they would be deploying. And so, no, I'm not surprised at all. I'm not surprised that they thought that was a flashpoint of leverage that would allow for the conversations to be, perhaps more balanced. I think it's great that both sides determined to try to buy some, de-escalation.
To put their guns down.
Yeah, just to have a period of time where maybe cooler heads can prevail and we can start working on things around the margins where you can actually make the relationship better and stronger. Not being naive about the larger considerations that really haven't been solved and probably won't be solved.
That's what I was going to ask.
And I wouldn't have high hopes for 2026 being the year that those
Kumbaya.
Those issues get resolved. But I think domestic politics on both sides are playing a role, and I think having a little bit of a détente is a good thing. And I think the two leaders are going to see each other, I think, quite a number of times in 2026. either in G20 settings or in bilateral settings in the two countries. And I think that's a good thing, to try to create more dialogue and more opportunity to find, some common ground in a relationship that is obviously going to be very complicated and is a real strategic rivalry. I think Pax Americana, to Gina's point, was America in a superpower position leading the world. And now I think there is a rival that is a strategic rival in many respects that is, America hasn't seen that for quite a long time, if ever.
Mm-hmm. I was surprised, actually. I was the other way surprised. I wasn't at all surprised China played that card. I was surprised that the administration seemed surprised that it happened and didn't seem to have a plan for it. I mean, that's a huge amount of leverage that China had. It seemed kind of obvious they would go there. And I think we're foolish if we think they won't. I mean, whether it's rare earths or medicine or number of clinical trials that the United States does, there's so many points of leverage, which is why I don't think there's going to, I think this U.S.-Chinese relationship over the next couple of years will be sort of the way it is now, status quo, because neither side wants or can afford escalation.
Yeah, we wrote an op-ed that we called Strategic Interdependence, which is kind of how we think the relationship is evolving, which is there is significant interdependence. And so there are areas where you could decouple, maybe chips as an example where you will decouple and are decoupled. But there's many areas where the interdependence is so significant that it's quite hard to decouple. And I think both sides are probably appreciating that more, every time they meet and understand the
consequences.
The consequences on both sides. And for the global economy.
A bunch of the questions I've gotten actually are a nice segue into the second leg of our discussion, which is industrial policy. One of the questions, if the White House continues to insist on taking stakes in U.S. companies, and this seems likely, what are the implications of that? Well, we're fortunate to have Gina sitting here, who was the architect of the Biden administration's, I think, $8.5 billion investment in Intel as part of the CHIPS Act. Now you have the Trump administration taking a 10% equity stake in Intel. Tell me if you see differences between those two actions. An $8.5 billion federal loan and the federal government actually taking an equity stake in a company. And philosophically and constructively, how do you think about it?
Yeah. So I think they are different. I would say this. I think history is pretty clear that state-owned enterprises or companies that feel the federal government has their back, those aren't going to be the most innovative, productive, profitable companies. Like in our system, as flawed as it is, capitalism works. Competition makes companies better. And what we did with the CHIPS Act, which I'm proud of, we wanted to account for the fact that it's much more expensive to build a semiconductor foundry in the U.S. than in Southeast Asia. So we were providing a one-time grant to close the gap in the CapEx expenditure. But then the company had to operate, they had to compete. They had to compete in the open market. And, I do think that's better. Whereas when a business owns, this is
You mean when the
funny.
government owns?
When the government owns is a funny thing. So our son is 18. And when the government took a big stake in Intel, he's like, Mom, we got to buy Intel. I said, why do you say that? And he said, the government will never let it fail.
Right.
I don't think that's good. I don't know. That's not our system in America. We don't want the government to own the means of production. We want the best companies are the ones that can compete and out-compete and out-innovate in the open market. And so if you think the government's got your back and you can't fail, I don't think it's great.
Now, just to be a devil's advocate on that, we have had different moments throughout U.S. history when there's a real crisis or a perceived crisis where the government does take either a leadership role or puts a broad safety net beneath American businesses. The auto industry during the great financial crisis. Trump 1.0 when there were incentives for vaccine manufacturers. Jimmy Carter and Chrysler. Woodrow Wilson and the railroads during World War I. It's all low, and even in the Elon Musk's businesses, at least 3 of them benefited from extraordinary federal largesse or federal partnerships. So is this actually that new?
It's just the method by which you look. I was the primary architect and driver of the CHIPS Act. I clearly believe in some amount of strategic precision industrial strategy. I just think there's a difference between saying, here's a one-time grant to help you account for the fact that it's more expensive to build in the U.S. versus taking such a large equity stake in a company that ought to be able to compete in the open market. By the way, the U.S. government has many tools in the toolbox to stimulate an industry that we think is strategic for our national security. We can do grants, we can do tax incentives, we can use the DoD's procurement power. If you're a young company, the most precious thing is a customer, the first customer. So and the federal government could be that first customer. All of these things are more consistent with our open capital market system of our economy. And so I'm not anti some intervention. I mean, like you said, we have agricultural subsidies, we have all kinds of subsidies in moments of crisis. CHIPS were a national security effort. We need to intervene in the market to protect our national security. The market doesn't price in national security. I'm fine with it. I just don't love the government taking big stakes in companies that produce these things.
John, we chatted recently. You made a distinction between industrial policy and industrializing, I think, policy. And talk a little bit about that we have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll be brief. First, I think government intervention in the markets and the economy is here to stay. I mean, I just think we've crossed the Rubicon, whether that's stakes in companies or supply agreements.
Because of the lay of the land globally.
I think the lay of the land globally, and I think that, whether it was the financial crisis or other elements of crises in the world, the government has stepped in for better or for worse and played a real role. And I think that's become more part of our capital markets. Whether you like it or you dislike it, I don't really see it changing. Second, what we talk about with industrialized policy is more along the lines of what Gina was referring to, which is, and we're seeing a lot of this going on in this administration, which is, let me find these companies that have sourcing capability of important elements in the supply chain that the government cares a lot about, whether it's rare earths or elements in the chip supply chain, penicillin and the like, things that the government should care a lot about strategically that have national security implications. And let's go find those companies and actually create sourcing agreements. And then on the back of those sourcing agreements, you can go raise capital. Those companies can go raise capital. That's different than the government taking a stake in the company. That's the government actually sourcing supply that's important and enabling that company to actually go raise money in the capital markets more attractively than they otherwise may have been able to in the day prior to that. We support that. We're doing a lot of that ourselves and working with a bunch of those companies. I think that's pretty good policy. And that to me is a recognition, let's say vis-a-vis China as an example, that we need to control more of our supply chain for national security purposes. That to me is more industrialized policy that I think is a smart way to approach it. China is a different competitor than we've seen, as we talked about earlier. And I think that we just letting our market forces run wild without any top-down focus, particularly from a national security perspective, I think is a mistake if we're going to really compete and actually have a chance to win in some of these races that are going to really matter for the future, whether it's in AI or it's in quantum or biopharma production, biotech, and so forth. So that to us is quantum good policy. I tend to agree with Gina. The government taking large stakes in big companies and controlling the means of production, not the best way to go. But I could see more intelligent, targeted precision, opportunities to secure secure supply for national security purposes, which we think makes sense, and utilize the capital markets effectively to finance that.
I'm always amazed at how fast these sessions go. We have 43 seconds left. I'm going to ask you both the same question. If you could take out a magic wand and change anything you could about the current tariff environment, what would it be?
I think John
should go first.
Okay, I'll start. I would say instead of let's tariff everybody and have a universal approach, I would say let's focus on our allies. Let's have more of a multilateral approach. USMCA to me would be a good example. And if we're targeting having more competitive advantage in the world, let's do it not as America only, but let's do it alongside our allies in a multilateral approach. I think that means we will have certain tariffs, but they'll be very targeted. There'll be more precision to them. Now they'll be more geared towards having a multilateral view as to how we're going to approach the world, not a unilateral view.
I love that and agree. Can you do 5 seconds? I wish I could, that they would have articulated a clear strategy. Like, what are we trying to get done here? And exactly what is our strategy? Because I think worse than the tariffs is the uncertainty and the seeming random nature of it.
Gina Raimondo and John Waldron, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the time.